Hello. First of all, let me say this is a special occasion. We welcome our buddy Steve Edwards, the former executive director of the IOP, back tonight, proving that Thomas Wolfe was wrong when he said you can't go home again. Welcome home, Steve. Secondly, I noticed, I was thinking about this. You probably saw this. Josh Earnest, who succeeded you as press secretary, your old deputy, is now coming to Chicago to work for United Airlines. Robert Gibbs, your predecessor, came to Chicago to work for McDonald's. And if you could just arrange for Amazon to come here, we could have a hat trick of former White House press secretaries right here in Chicago. So just make a note of that, will you? On Monday, we'll be welcoming former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie to the IOP. Also on Monday, we're partnering with the Pulitzer Center for a discussion on the refugee crisis in Myanmar. On Tuesday, we are hosting a panel discussion on the future of immigration reform. And on Thursday, May 24th, a former National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, will be speaking with Ann Gearin of the Washington Post about the security challenges facing the United States and current issues. That will be a 6-hour-long program, so not really. I don't want you to adjust your calendars accordingly. You can find out more about all of our upcoming events on the website at politics.uchicago.edu. As always, we'll open the floor for audience questions. The first 3 questions will be prioritized for students. There'll be a microphone right there in the middle aisle. And silence your cell phones, restrooms downstairs. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Kaylee Suberwall. Kaylee is a third year from Frisco, Colorado, studying political science. She has been a senior writer for The Gate, our undergraduate political review, and she is now The Gate's incoming co-editor-in-chief. So welcome, Kaylee.
Thank you. I'm Kaylee, and I'd like to introduce the former White House Press Secretary, Jay Carney. Mr. Carney began working as a journalist at the Miami Herald and Time magazine, working at the Moscow Bureau of Time for 3 years before moving to Washington, D.C. to cover the Clinton administration and to serve as Time's Washington bureau chief. In 2008, he began serving as the Director of Communications to Vice President Joe Biden, and in 2011, he replaced Robert Gibbs as the Press Secretary for President Obama. Mr. Carney now works as the Senior Vice President of Worldwide Corporate Affairs for Amazon, where he oversees public relations and public policy. Moderating this event is Steve Edwards, the Vice President and Chief Content Officer at WBEZ and the former Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. Mr. Edwards served as the host of the WBEZ show The Afternoon Shift before joining the IOP in 2012. He spent 5 years at the IOP, working to bring in amazing speakers and to create programs for students at UChicago to become engaged in politics and service. Mr. Edwards rejoined WBEZ in 2017. This evening, Mr. Carney and Mr. Edwards join us for a conversation about the Obama administration, the relationship between the White House and the press, and Mr. Carney's work at Amazon. Please welcome Jay Carney and Steve Edwards.
Thank you, Kaylee.
Thanks,
Thank
Kaylee.
you, David, and the rest of the team. It's an honor to be back here. And Jay, a thrill to be with you. Thank you so much for making time for the IOP.
Well, I'll do anything for my old friend and colleague, Axe, and so here I am, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, the feeling's mutual, and I'm glad to hear from the list of events you guys have slowed way down since I was here. I want to start by referencing my favorite podcast. You might have heard of it. It's called The Axe Files. And you said in that conversation to David, in relationship to the Trump White House and the job of the White House press secretary, you said, quote, "It's not a job I recognize." What do you mean by that today?
Have you got 6 hours? What I meant is that when I was press secretary, and I think when every one of my, I believe, 28 predecessors were press secretary, and my immediate successor, Josh Earnest, had the job, that there were things that you accepted as part of your responsibility. And first and foremost, that was to convey factual information, to represent factually, to the best of your ability, what the president was thinking and doing and why, and to answer questions from the press as honestly as you could, mindful of a variety of prerogatives, including protecting secret information, confidential information, and not getting out ahead of the president when it came to policy making. The idea, somebody asked me relatively early in this administration's tenure, what was it like when President Obama had asked me to lie at the podium, or when one of my colleagues, like David Axelrod, said I should go out and say something that I knew wasn't true, and it simply never happened, and it's inconceivable to me that it ever would have happened, because every one of the predecessors of mine that I spoke to who was alive, and I had known virtually all of them, before I did my first briefing, gave me one piece of absolutely consistent advice, and that was never lie. You don't have to, not because you're morally superior to somebody who might, but because the credibility you have will erode much more quickly to the detriment of the president, to the White House, to the administration, and to the country if you get caught in an untruth. That doesn't mean that every word I ever said was accurate, but when I found out, or my colleagues found out after the fact, that I had said something that turned out not to be true, unknowingly, we rushed to correct it, and we were mortified when that turned out to be the case. And I think that when I say that it didn't occur to anybody, again, I'm not trying to say that we were morally or ethically superior, but it simply wasn't something that was done as we understood it. You obviously put the best spin on a set of facts that you could. You believed, as I did, in the policies that we were putting forward and why they were the right policies, and you made that case, but you didn't make it up. And you, I think, wouldn't, because it would be humiliating when it was so easily discovered that you had, which has been the case in the current administration.
But you clearly had to have plenty of instances, as did your predecessors, when you either couldn't give a full response, or there were matters of sensitive information, or you weren't prepared to fully articulate the administration's evolving position on something. So as a press secretary standing at the podium, how do you deal with instances like that?
So you say I can't comment on national security matters, or when somebody would ask about reported in the Washington Post today was this classified or clandestine operation, and I'll say, by definition, I'm not going to talk about that, and I can't. Or I simply don't have anything for you on that. I mean, it was not a satisfying answer, but it was also, there was no need to lie about it or make something up about it. And I often would say, we'll get back to you if there was, if I thought there was an opportunity that we could actually provide more information, but we weren't ready to at that moment when I was in front of the cameras, that we would get back to the reporter or to the whole briefing room with that information. It's an adversarial relationship, and it should be. The day that it's not, I think, will be a bad day for our democracy. But the tension that exists there should be between an individual representing an institution that's making a lot of decisions on behalf of the American people and serving the American people, and trying to get it right. And an institution, the free press, that's trying to find out as much about that process and those decisions as possible. And there's going to be tension between the two in terms of how you release that information, when, and the way you shape it and form it. But it shouldn't be a debate about, is up and is down, is black and is white. It shouldn't be that.
So take us, if you can, behind the scenes into the process of working as White House press secretary, director of communications, what we don't see, because we watch, seemingly hour by hour, day by day, live on cable news, certainly at all moments, day or night, on social media via the president's Twitter feed now, messages coming, questions, changing positions, et cetera. But what we don't see is what's happening behind the scenes inside this administration. But you said this is an unrecognizable job in terms of that relationship around veracity and reliability and credibility. But what about the behind the scenes? How does a White House communications operation work ideally?
Well,
in terms of day-to-day messaging, coordination, who's saying what when? So
that I don't know how it works now, or whether it is significantly different in the way it operates on a day-to-day basis than the way it was when I was there, notwithstanding how it ends up in presentation form during a briefing. But you spend your morning. I would come in, senior staff meeting with the most senior advisors in the chief of staff's office, way too early for me, 7:30, and you're supposed to be up to speed on everything that's happened. So you've gotten up a lot earlier. I'd gotten up a lot earlier. As the longer I did the job, the more I sort of cut corners, I have to admit. But and would speed read on my way in, even though I was driving, and wasn't a lot of traffic. But but you also begin to sort of absorb so much information, sort of create a repository of information that on every issue as you go forward. But yeah, I would wake up early in the morning and read in before my family got up. I was fortunate. I lived close enough to the White House that I could time it so that I would do all my reading. I would be dressed and ready to go, and could then wake up my kids and see them. And we kind of left at the same time. They went to school, and I went off to the I left a little earlier. Went off to the White House, but only about 15 minutes. So, and I would always walk in at about 7:29 and 59 seconds, and. So then we would have, from that was the first meeting, a series of a bigger senior staff meeting in the Roosevelt Room. Then usually my staff would meet, or the broader communications staff would meet in the press secretary's office. Then there were meetings, senior advisors meetings with the president, or policy meetings that often or usually involve the president that I would try to attend, because he was looking for my advice on policy, but because it helped me immensely to hear that discussion, and especially hear how he talked about an issue, so that it kind of gave me the verbal parameters around how I could discuss something, even though I knew more narrowly what we were specifically saying about an issue, and I wouldn't reflect the internal debate, but I would at least know where his head was. And then I would prep for a briefing usually for the hour before the briefing, and I have deputy press secretaries, assistant press secretaries, and then policy folks come in. Sometimes somebody from the counsel's office, national security team. Sometimes when I thought something was super sensitive and I didn't feel like I had it totally right, or that I wasn't getting what I necessarily wanted, I would, if he was available, walk down the hall and ask the president just for clarity on something. I tried not to abuse that, but he was always willing to do that because he thought it mattered. And then you got through it, and what had happened actually before I went out there is that the press office had been taking incoming all morning and overnight, so they knew what reporters were interested in. They largely knew what kinds of questions they were going to be asking. What the storylines were. We didn't get the questions in advance, which is some crazy assertion that has been made at times. And the hardest days were the days where there wasn't a dominant storyline, because you had to kind of prepare for everything, any random subject that might come up. Often I'd come out of a briefing and hear from somebody and say, "Oh, that looked so hard because they were hammering you on this." But if they were hammering me about one subject for 70% of the briefing, that was easy, because I usually had I knew what I was going to say on that. And usually mistakes came when they asked you something that you didn't expect. Yeah. As many people know here, and from your introduction, not only your work and your career, you spent really a full career in journalism before moving into government, first with Vice President Biden and then with President Obama.
Dealing from the other side of the podium then, what frustrated you most about the White House press corps that you may not have realized
so when
from being a
I
White House correspondent or a Washington correspondent?
I think I was very lucky to have had this great period of 2 years where I worked for Vice President Biden as his communications director, which was an off-camera, behind-the-scenes job, just helping him strategize with the broader White House comms operation, around his narrative and the overall narrative. I learned a ton, and I learned a ton from people like Axelrod and others about how that works from the inside. I thought I knew a lot having covered it as a reporter and realized that I had a lot to learn. I also learned a lot both in that experience and then when I did become press secretary about my former profession. And I probably had a dimmer view of my friends in the press corps than I had when I was a member of the press corps. But I also learned much more clearly about what made a good White House reporter, often to our frustration, right? But and why it was so annoying and frustrating when the White House press corps would grab hold of an issue like a bunch of kids, in a 6-year-old soccer team, all chasing the same ball down the field, and try to elevate everything into some kind of sensation when it wasn't. It's interesting now, it's almost quaint to think about what were the alleged scandals in the Obama administration. But often they would flare up and it would become incredibly tense in the briefing room around a certain issue, and then a couple weeks would pass, and because it had fizzled out and it turned out not to be a scandal because it wasn't, they would stop asking about that very same subject, and that could be frustrating. So one of the things I learned in retrospect was how I could have been a better reporter. I saw sometimes in some of the folks who were cutting corners or being prone to sort of following the pack, behavior that sometimes I exhibited as a reporter, like I fell prey to, and I wish I hadn't.
Like what?
Covering the Clinton White House, getting probably overly exercised about Whitewater, and making, this was before the Lewinsky scandal, but when it was just a real estate deal, and that tendency to believe that this week's big story is the next Watergate or is the next Iran-Contra or name your scandal, and we experienced this in the Obama White House where everything was the next Hurricane Katrina or the next Obama's this, Obama's that, and they tended not to be what the press corps and our critics wanted them to be in terms of the enormity of the scandal or the sensation.
Now we're in a moment where it seems like we as a nation and the White House press corps and the White House itself are careening from one scandal to another, and at the heart of it is a huge international conversation about the role that Russia played in trying to shape and affect and manipulate the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. You spent considerable time in Moscow as a correspondent for Time magazine. You were a Russian studies major in college, spoke fluent or certainly significantly proficient Russian during that time. You were there during a critical phase in really the transformation from the Soviet Union to Russia and the Gorbachev-Yeltsin transition there. So I'm curious to know what in your experience there helps inform your understanding of what Russia is doing now and what it is alleged to have done throughout the course of the 2016 campaign.
I like the way you asked that question because I remember when I was studying Russian, my parents were wondering what the hell I was doing, and then it turned out to be such a great thing to have done. I graduated from college in 1987, which was right when Mikhail Gorbachev was beginning to significantly change the world. And I ended up there as a reporter in '89, and then with Time magazine, and living there in the spring of '90 for 3 years, which covered the collapse of the Soviet Union. And my Russian came in very handy. I didn't think after I got back to DC that it would come in handy again, but it seems to be useful language these days in ways that I hadn't anticipated. What I would tell you about that experience is that the Russian, I don't want to stereotype or overgeneralize, but there is an injured pride among Russians about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the diminution of Russia as a great power that has been masterfully exploited by Vladimir Putin as president. And he has leveraged that resentment in a way to jack up his own popularity, and which in turn has given him to jack up his own popularity, and through that, given him the opportunity to follow through on a bunch of policies aimed at disrupting the West, splitting the United States from its allies in Europe, and undermining the sort of overall principle that it unified Western countries in the lead up to and the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
We now know through reporting, through James Comey's recent book and other things, that interest in, knowledge of, and concern about Russian interference in the election was certainly made aware to the president and to the Obama administration. And increasing players, not only inside the intelligence apparatus, but in the White House itself, were aware of what was going on here. What were you aware of?
So I had left.
Oh, yeah, of course you left, yeah. My question, forgive me.
I left in the summer of 2014,
Yeah.
so the election interference had not occurred yet, any evidence of that kind of tampering had yet to appear. What had happened before I left was the turn by Putin and by Russia to a much more hostile stance towards the United States and towards the West, the invasion of eastern Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and the fact that we had a significant challenge on our hands as a country, and that Russia was asserting itself in a way that was very destabilizing. I think I think you're probably going to ask, had I been there, or now observing, having been there shortly before then, was the right decision made about how to deal with that information and how to convey it publicly? And it's really hard to second guess in this situation, because there is no question that had the president himself come out and forcefully asserted that Russia was interfering in the election, and maybe even asserted that it's pretty clear from the evidence that Russia's trying to tip the election in one direction, that would have been discounted as political interference by the president, and would have been, the Republicans would have tried to undercut him significantly. I think he saw this, I know he saw this as a major national security challenge, and didn't want it to be diminished by politics. So he took the approach he did, which was to inform, make sure leaders were informed, to make sure that the public announcement, the public conveyance of the information came from the intelligence community and the national security community, and not from the White House. And ultimately, Senator McConnell and other Republican leaders, made the decision to be dismissive of it as it was, and I think that was unfortunate.
Yeah. Would you have played it differently had you been inside and advising the president?
It's impossible to know. I think I would have been very open to the arguments about what it would have sounded like for the Obama White House to come out and raising the alarm about Russian interference on behalf of the Republican candidate for president. And given that nobody had seen, we in the public, and I think nobody in the political world had seen evidence that the Russian tampering was going to turn the election. I could understand the decision not to make it a higher profile.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's easy to second guess.
You talked earlier about how you had consulted predecessors in your role before taking the job. Sort of two questions about that. One is the advice that you ultimately gave to Josh Earnest, but the other was when you moved into this role, but also when you moved into government generally. What was your biggest fear, leaving the press corps into this? What did you fear most?
So I'll go with the what did I tell Josh? Nobody has been better prepared from day one. It's cliche to take over that job than Josh was, because he had been deputy for my principal deputy and had been a deputy for the entirety of the Obama White House. And he had, when I was press secretary, filled in for me on a number of occasions. I mean, I deliberately gave him at bats so that he, because I knew, because my wife told me I would be leaving before the end of the end of the 8 years. It was important that he be ready to go. I mean, obviously there were a lot of, the president could have gone in a number of directions, and there were super highly qualified candidates, but Josh was particularly well qualified. So there wasn't much I could tell him that he didn't already know. But I did repeat the same advice that I had gotten, which is, never go up there and say something you know not to be true. Obviously, it's the wrong thing to do. That's what our mothers told us. But it's also, it's not necessary. And don't get stuck. It's better to say I don't know, or I can't answer that, or I'll take that question and get back to you than to make something up. Or give an answer that, it's not make something up, but give an answer that you think you're sort of guessing in your head is right. And this came back and bit me once, early days. On a very trivial matter I think it was about a trip the president was taking, and whether the first lady was going to be accompanying him. And I think I said she was, and then it turned, because I had heard that or thought it was the case, it seemed not important, and I just said that as part of a matter-of-fact announcement, and then we ended up having to put out a little correction because it wasn't the case. And it was just a perfect example of everything you say is going to be scrutinized, so make sure everything you say is right, and don't fake it. What was the other question?
The other question was just your fear coming into this, making the transition.
So fear is a great.
I want to circle back to
fear is a great word.
Second.
So one of the things that I'm so grateful for the experience is that I've been a journalist for 21 years. I loved it. I was Time bureau chief. Great job. It wasn't another job in journalism I wanted. So I had been doing, something similar for a long time, and the opportunity. I wasn't an advocate as a reporter. A point of pride. I remember when I first went to the White House for Vice President Biden, there was an article in the New York Times announcing, well, this was during the transition, announcing that I had been hired. And Joe Klein, who was a columnist for Time magazine and somebody I had worked with for years, was quoted in the article saying, "I always thought Jay was a Republican," and I wasn't, but I hadn't been an advocate as a reporter, but personally I was just caught up in Obama's candidacy and everything he talked about and that he represented, and was just enormously gratified to have the opportunity to go inside for what I thought would be a couple of years. I mean, the honest truth is, one of my best friends is a guy named Tony Blinken, who ended up being your Deputy Secretary of State, but he was
a fellow here at the INP.
And a fellow, and he was in my shitty garage band. And the day after the election, I was talking to Tony, and I was, he knew how excited I was, and I was congratulating him, and he and I were talking, and he said, you should think about coming in. And I thought, well, maybe with my Russian, I could go do something in the State Department. But he said Biden would be looking for somebody to run his communications team. And that didn't mean I'd get the job, but it did begin a conversation that led to me leaving. And it was terrifying, because I realized very quickly that covering a White House is not the same as working in one, and that covering communications and messaging is not the same as helping shape it or produce it, and covering a White House in a crisis is not the same as being a White House in crisis and dealing with how you manage, those kinds of cascading challenges. And I loved both, but I have to say this, I used to say that the best job I ever had, the best moment in my career was being in Moscow in August of '91, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So unbelievably exciting, and that's now second to being able to speak for Barack Obama and his administration and the United States of America. Nothing tops that.
From a media standpoint, one of the things that President Obama became known for, and indeed the White House became known for strategically, was some called it going around the Washington press corps, others called it just connecting with new forms of media, new audiences, but having the president show up on, Jimmy Fallon's The Tonight Show or The Daily Show or Between Two Ferns.
Oh,
with
that was my
Zach
favorite.
Galifianakis.
I remember Valerie Jarrett and I sold that to him. And
how'd that pitch meeting go?
We were standing right outside the Oval Office, and we went and presented it to him. And we said that Bradley Cooper had this idea, and Zach Galifianakis, and POTUS was, President Obama was interesting. He goes, well, and he misunderstood at first. He said, well, thank Bradley for doing that. And Valerie was like, no, you're going to do it. and he's like, if you guys think so. So that was a lot of fun.
So what was the thinking behind those kinds of appearances? And how deliberate was that as a strategy?
Simple calculation that we had to reach people where they were. They weren't watching in the same numbers the evening news. They weren't reading newspapers as they had to the degree that they had in the past, and they weren't watching cable news. I mean, it was cable news in particular, but all the political reporting drove the conversation in Washington, but that conversation wasn't necessarily reaching the audiences that we needed to reach. That audience mattered, and those audiences mattered, but we had to find ways to get to other Americans, and the campaign in 2008 had done a terrific job in using the tools that were available then in reaching people in ways that hadn't been reached before. And what was striking about the White House, especially now working for a tech company, is how technologically impoverished the place was, the whole administration, and how few people we were able to, as an institution, to dedicate to exploring and exploiting new means of communication through technology. But that's all it was. It was a simple decision. Is the risk of doing something like this outweighed by the possible benefit? And I think we're sometimes criticized for doing unorthodox things. I wish we had done more in retrospect, and the White House did, and President Obama did do more after I left, and I was glad to see that. And I'll tell you one thing about, President Obama was the first president to have a Twitter handle, but nothing he ever tweeted went out before we saw it. And I still think that should be practiced in general for a president, but President Trump has demonstrated how powerful that tool is, no question, and could be. I mean, I'm intrigued to think about what we could have done or what a future president could do. With
just
that
communicating directly to the American people through social media.
There are obviously huge issues associated with that, but he's certainly onto something.
As somebody who has occupied the roles inside an administration and obviously covered them, just in a dispassionate, nonpartisan way, help break down the media strategy you think that the Trump administration's employing. How would you characterize it? Is it strategic? Is it tactical? What's happening here that we're seeing?
I wouldn't pretend to know, to be an insider, but I mean, I think he is the media strategy, and he runs it. I'm pretty sure he hasn't even replaced his communications director, so which I think reflects that, and it's driven largely by his pronouncements, which occur mostly on social media, but also occasionally through other formats.
Is it working for him?
Well, I think it produces a lot of churn and problems. Like from just a past political professional point of view, the biggest problem with that approach is that you are constantly blowing up your own message. And that could be a goal, but there are times, I would say, in this year and a half that they had a message they wanted to get out that was actually probably a pretty good one that would have been effective on economic policy or other things that they wanted to push that was completely overshadowed or outshouted by some other issue that arose largely because the president had tweeted about it.
We're going to take your questions here, and so I think we're going to pass a microphone around or get a microphone. We'll get the microphone stand, set up, and we'll take questions from you in just a second. So I encourage you to think about your questions. We'll take the first 3 from students in the audience, but as we set up the microphone here in a second, I want to talk more about your current role at Amazon. And I just really have one question. Is Chicago getting HQ too?
Wouldn't Rom like to know, right?
But tell me more seriously about that process.
So what I can tell you is what
we've
we've said publicly and what we've said to every city and region that was interested, and all the 20 cities and regions that are part of the process right now, which is we're doing this. It's completely transparent. There is no secret list. There is no it's not like we know or Jeff Bezos, the CEO, knows already where we're going to go. We sent out teams to make site visits to all of the 20 locations, to meet with officials, to learn about, labor, what the labor pool looks like, what the real estate opportunities are, what all the different factors, because this is a big investment, obviously, with a lot of jobs attached to it, and a big decision for a company to make. What I can tell you is we're a long way from making it. We're still at that process where we announced the 20. And in the process of evaluating all the data that's come in, but it's super exciting, and the response has been gratifying. It's not often, one thing that when I talk about Amazon, which often gets described as one of America's big tech companies, and it certainly is a tech company. But one thing that is different about it is that we are very labor intensive because of our business model, and that we hire a lot of people, we employ a lot of people, and in the United States, that's I think well over 300,000 are getting there, and well over 550,000 globally. And I believe in the last year we've hired more people in America than any other company in America, and that's creating jobs. I liked being part of a team that was doing that at the White House, and I like being part of a company that's doing it now.
But as you also well know, Amazon has been a major disruptor in so many industries, books most notably, but we can go through a list of industries where entire sectors and indeed many individuals have been displaced and watched their own business fortunes shrivel as a result of Amazon and its size and its reach and its ability to really price below where others can. So what do you say to that criticism that yes, it's hiring, but also at a cost?
Well, I would say that the way you described it reflects a misunderstanding about Amazon, which is because it is a company that is engaged in so many different businesses, so many disparate businesses, or seemingly disparate. Like, we have a Hollywood studio, we make movies and create content. We sell books, both ebooks and print books. We sell, obviously, everything on Amazon.com, and we have a cloud computing business, and one day there'll be drones and the like. A massive logistics business, is that it seems bigger than it is. And in fact, we're much smaller than some of the biggest retailers in America. We still are. And
smaller than who? You seem big.
Walmart's the biggest retailer in America, and we're significantly smaller than Walmart. And retail itself is
But Walmart is struggling mightily to develop an online strategy to compete.
I think Walmart is a very strong competitor and has demonstrated that all the time. I think from what I'm pretty sure that more folks in America by a significant margin have shopped at Walmart than have shopped at Amazon. And I'm not saying that's a good thing because I work for Amazon, but I'm just saying this is a sector. Retail is the deepest, broadest sector imaginable. It's the most competitive sector imaginable. It's globally probably something like a $15 or $20 trillion business, and we're a significant player in e-commerce. E-commerce is maybe 10% of retail in America, and is less as a percentage globally. So we're a big e-commerce player, which is 10% of retail, which makes us a pretty small retailer overall when you look at the big retail market. One thing I'll tell you, I remember because I was part of it, is when we announced that we were going to purchase Whole Foods. Some of the press around that made it sound like we were buying all of grocery in America. And I think that was because, in part, the folks who were writing about it and talking about it all shopped at Whole Foods, and it felt like we were buying their grocery. But combined, Whole Foods and Amazon is less than 3% of grocery. We're much smaller than every major chain you can think of, including Walmart and others. So, we're in a lot of businesses. We tend to be shallow and not deep in those businesses. We tend to try a lot of things because it's a very innovative company that's focused on the customer and what we think the customer might want. Sometimes those things succeed, sometimes they don't. You might have a Alexa-powered device, an Echo. They're amazing. They're terrific.
How many
right?
people here have an Alexa smart speaker in
Yeah.
their home?
I mean, they're super fun.
Okay.
Like, you ask it what the weather is, play music for you. That was the device that we launched not long after I started at Amazon. The device previous to that was something called the Fire Phone. How many people own a Fire Phone? Exactly. And the Fire Phone had an incredible amount of innovative technology, and it just didn't. It wasn't the right product at the right time in the right market, and it didn't succeed. Although Amazon invested a whole lot of money in trying to make it work.
You talked about the diversification and the fact that Amazon is playing in so many different spaces. So at this point in Amazon's life cycle, what's the strategy? How do these things fit together for it as a vision for the company looking ahead?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask about the vision for the company, or at least to give the best possible answer, because I am Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon, is probably the only person who has all of this in his head, and his bandwidth is extraordinary. But I think he would say that what connects everything we do is this sort of relentless focus on the customer, right? Everything begins with this customer obsession, including the proposition around the retail market, which is low prices, vast selection, and fast service, right? And those sort of principles are what started with creating more selection than could be found in a physical bookstore, and then expanding to other kinds of products, and then Prime, which way back when that was announced, I think a lot of analysts thought that was crazy, because the most expensive part of e-commerce and shopping online, and the most frustrating part, was shipping, and the idea was it's like, what's the barrier to getting people to shop online? The shipping costs and delay is really what are the big obstacles. And so Amazon said, hey, how about free 2-day shipping, which at the time was revolutionary and has proven to be something that customers love. What that customer obsession means is that we don't, as a company, spend a lot of time just doing academic research, which some companies do. We tend to, like, our scientists and developers tend to be focused on even when it's super high-tech stuff like artificial intelligence and machine learning, tend to be focused on like applications. Are you working on something that can ultimately be built?
How this works in the user experience.
Right, and then give something to the customer that the customer likes. The Alexa, the smart assistant, whether it's ours or somebody else's, is really driven by the magic of cloud computing, which allows your question, to fly off to the cloud and be processed and answered in conversational time, and that takes a lot of data crunching.
Yeah, we want to take your questions, so feel free to come up and line up behind the microphone. We'll go the first 3 questions from students and then open the floor to the rest of you. As we do, just a quick follow-up. How should we think about data in all of this, which is essential to your operation, and you're hardly alone, but we as consumers are giving a lot of it up, often willingly, often sort of unknowingly. So how should we think about that?
Well, I think data issues are important, and data privacy is very important, and the conversations we're having about it are important. I would, our model is a little different because customers come to us.
Yep.
We have a relationship with each individual customer. They supply data. We don't sell it. We have that relationship directly with them. Others have models where that data itself is the product, and that's not our model.
Yeah. All right, we'll take a question here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mike. I'm a 4th-year medical student here. That you touched upon how using social media to directly talk to voters and just American citizens, so you could talk to them directly as opposed to talking to the press. But one of the changes with that is the press reporting often know the policy details or know more about them than the average American voter. What strategies did you use to explain more complex topics to people who are less informed about the policy details?
That's a great question, and I'd say that all the strategies we tried failed. I mean, it's hard to explain complex policies in a way that is compelling. I found that hard as a reporter when I was writing about them, and I think it's hard when you're messaging around them as a communicator for the White House. But I think that it worked best when you thought about explaining it and how it affected the American you were talking to, the person you were talking to, and not how policy works at a macro level, but how it works at the ground level in communities and towns and cities and individual kitchen tables. When I think we and others get lost and are less effective when we throw around big numbers and talking about policies, and this many people will be helped and this many people will get this percentage of the population will get a tax cut, and those big numbers are less meaningful than I think the powerful anecdotes or the descriptions of how individuals are affected. And I think that's true about storytelling in general, and it's true about when you're trying to explain policies.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Madalena. I'm a first year in the college. You mentioned earlier that there were a lot of scandals that were loud but not particularly important that sort of annoyed you. What's one of those specifically that you remember, and how do you think we as consumers of news can avoid giving too much attention to them? How can we identify them?
Well, that's a great question. What's one that the trivial answer would be the tan suit that Obama wore, which Fox News made into a running story as a outrage and an offense. But there were a number of things that we had. These are important issues, but they weren't monumental scandals, and they tended to have somewhat mundane and pedestrian explanations. But some of the challenges that the Veterans Administration faced when we were there, some of the issues around IRS, and how they dealt with nonprofits, that was one where that became highly politicized, and one that was. I'll tell you, people often ask me what the worst day I had was as press secretary, and I give two answers. One is, on just pure emotion, it was the day of the Newtown shooting, and because I think we all just felt so helpless, and if you're a parent, it's just unimaginable, and I definitely lost it at the briefing. But the other answer, it was healthcare.gov, which wasn't just one day. It was ongoing, slow-moving disaster. And what was distinct about it was that most of the challenges you face and things you have to explain when you're up there are about problems that you didn't cause or create, but that you have to have an answer to as a president in a White House or a country. Yeah. A natural disaster, something happening overseas, some event, or even something stupid that Congress has done. It's rare that you have to be like you're on the hot seat and having to explain something that was wholly your creation and is so unbelievably important as the Affordable Care Act was, and the mechanism for implementing it, which was healthcare.gov. And we were finding out literally in real time as I was up there just how bad the problem was. And there were days when we didn't know if it could be rescued, and those days were rough. But as an example of that was a disaster that was truly a disaster, and the press was right to report it that way. But then when it recovered, and then when we actually exceeded our enrollment targets, boy, crickets from the press.
Hi, Thank you so much for coming, and welcome back, Steve.
Thanks.
I'm Baxter. I'm a fourth year in the college studying public policy, and my question is about one of the biggest policy issues right now facing America is the issue of healthcare. And Amazon recently announced a partnership with two other major companies to enter into the healthcare space. So maybe could you just walk us through a little bit of the thinking behind that and how Amazon fits into that policy equation?
Sure. For those of you who don't know, I mean, sure, yes, I'll answer that question. I won't have a lot to say, unfortunately, and I'll tell you why. We announced a number of months ago that we were joining with J.P. Morgan Chase and Berkshire Hathaway to create a healthcare entity for our collective employees of those three companies. And what I think is the best answer to that question is like, what will that mean, and what will that look like? It was reflected in what my boss Jeff said about it, which is, in so many words, this is a big challenge that a lot of people have tried to tackle, and we're going to give it a shot. Basically, is what he said, and see how we do. And having covered healthcare as a reporter, worked on healthcare inside government, I mean, as a policy matter, domestic policy matter, there's nothing more complicated. What I like about being at Amazon is its willingness to take on these big challenges, and we'll see where it goes, but it's still very much in its early stages.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, as a quick follow-up, what insights do you have about the way in which government can make change and the way in which the private sector can make change, given the levers at their disposal and the tools that they have respectively, now having been on both sides of that equation?
Yeah, I think government does things that are necessary for governments to do, and that includes protecting the nation and educating our children and building our roads and our airports and our ports, among so many other important things, protecting our environment. The private sector can provide technological know-how. I mean, I think that one of the positive outcomes of the healthcare.gov disaster debacle, was the infusion of tech talent that came into the administration to help rescue it, and that then was leveraged to modernize the technological infrastructure of the entire executive branch. And that's a project that was really necessary and was in many ways born out of a real crisis, and it made a huge amount of progress in the time that President Obama was still in office. And I hope, I don't know, but I hope, but I had heard in early days of the Trump administration that they intended to continue that work, because there is a lot that the private sector, not just in tech but elsewhere, has to offer in terms of expertise and know-how and decision making, and one of the things that is even when you get to work in the White House, which is sort of a little oasis of executive action, government moves slowly, and sometimes it's by necessity. There's the checks and balances that that the framers created for a reason, but it can be frustrating. I mean, companies have the luxury of being able to develop a plan and execute on it very quickly and make decisions very quickly, and there are lessons, I think, positive lessons to be learned from that.
Yes.
Hi there. My name's Caroline. I'm a fourth year in the college. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
My question goes back to the beginning of your career at the Miami Herald, and I think it gets at your answer to the first question as well in terms of like the micro impacts of policy. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the future and sustainability of local journalism, especially when a lot of progress is happening at the state and local levels right now.
Well, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I'm worried about it because I think that this is we live in a moment right now where independent reporting sure seems vitally important to our democracy, and because it is and always has been. But boy, do we know it and feel it right now. And that's not just true at the national or international level, where the big stories are getting a lot of attention, and some great work is being done, and super talented reporters are doing it. But I worry a lot about the dissolution of a lot of daily newspapers and the reduction in overall local news coverage, and how that affects our communities, and I've seen some studies that how it affects the perceptions and outlooks of the people in those communities where they're not getting that kind of independent reporting. And I wish I could tell you I had an answer to the problem, but it's definitely a problem.
Did you feel the effects of that inside the White House, and was that a palpable thing that you noticed
I think
as you were working with and trying to message things?
Having worked for a national publication like Time Magazine, I had the wrong-headed attitude that we mattered a lot more than the local press. And of course, when I went into the White House and was told and quickly accepted as gospel that the local press is vitally important and in many ways more important. And we would often we had a whole team that engaged with regional and local press because it was so important, and because it offered us the opportunity, not just us, but anybody the opportunity to tell our story or put out our information in a way that what didn't necessarily get run through this cynical political lens that through which it was run by the national press. And the national press would complain that we were doing that, trying to go around them and taking advantage of the naivete of which was condescending and wrong. And I think that consumers out there were still hearing both and getting both. So I guess I saw it, and I was pleasantly aware of the fact that there were still a lot of outlets out there, radio, newspapers, but certainly fewer than there had been, and there are fewer now than there were when I was there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name's Dylan. I'm a second year in the college. I'm wondering if you can talk about the role of leaking and freelancing within a White House communications shop. How does the White House operate day to day like that, and how did you and your team sort of contain that and manage sort of those incentives?
When I was a reporter covering White Houses or covering Congress, I loved leaks. I loved them, and sought them out and took advantage of them. And then I spent 5.5 years as part of a team that fought hard against leaks, not because we were trying to deprive reporters of their daily bread, but because leaks inhibit a president's ability to make decisions. Right? They're often made with the goal, if they're policy related, with the goal. Whoever's leaking often has a goal of turning a policy decision or process in one direction or the other, and that can be, and you're hemming a president in when you do that, which is probably the leaker's goal. Those are unauthorized leaks. Now we would sometimes have authorized leaks. We would, we had something we wanted to say, and we would sit around and decide which outlet we
Who to give
thought
this to.
to give it to, and we would, and sometimes that was big news, or sometimes it was regional, so we knew that the region that was affected would give it more prominence and be more interested in it. But most of the leaks were not authorized. They were frustrating, and it felt like there were plenty of them, although the press complained that we were really effective at limiting them. And certainly by comparison, we were a completely tight ship, because I actually saw, you've reached another level when there's a story, as I saw today, about the culture of leaking as described by the leakers themselves currently in the administration of the White House, to the reporter who receives the leak. So it's one of the things that I got to work with, and I'm not just saying this because one of them's here, but I got to work with great people. And I'm 52, you don't get the opportunity in midlife to make a whole new set of friends that you would love to work with again and would go to battle with again, and who you trust and know have your back. And that's how I felt. I felt that the people I got to work with were there for the right reasons, and they weren't engaging in that kind of practice because they just didn't think it was the right thing to do. And that sounds, like the violin should start playing, but it really, that was the culture much more than had been traditional in the 2 administrations I covered, and certainly much more than the one we're seeing now.
I do love the idea of the meta story about leakers from leakers by leakers. All right, let's go to the next question. Yes.
Hello, I'm Michael. I'm a PR student actually, and I've been stalking your career for probably since I started college. So, huge fan. So I actually have a 2-part question. The first part question is, we're currently in an age and an era where everyone has a platform, which is a great thing, but it's also a hard thing because things aren't always fact checked. So in your experience, how did that help or hurt? And the second question is I felt, especially in his term, he spoke on race without speaking on it. However, it was obvious it impacted how stories came out. It impacted him, his wife, and his kids. So was that like a topic of discussion at the start, at the end, or in between? Or how did your team handle that situation?
So on the first question, I'll get to the question about race. One of the big first challenges I think that I really faced the first time as a press secretary was, you could prepare, as I described earlier, for the briefing all you wanted, and you could know right up to the minute you walked out there what reporters were asking about, and then get ready to answer those kinds of questions. What had never before been the case was this phenomenon of somebody in the front row looking at his or her phone and saying, Jay, this just showed up on Twitter. What's your response?
Yeah.
And it would be something that I didn't even know had happened, may have happened while I was up there, or may not have happened at all, of course, because who knows what's true when somebody's reading it off their phone. And it creates all sorts of challenges, that kind of environment, and you sort of extrapolate from there. How we found, and I'm sure it's just accelerated 100 times since then, that you had to, the social media and the speeding up of the news cycle meant that you had to be prepared to respond much more quickly than White House has had in the past. And I know Mike McCurry, who was one of Bill Clinton's press secretaries, they used to kick back in the press secretary's office with a drink and watch the evening news because their day was over, right? And they could begin to think about, I never watched the evening news once my whole time there, because my wife was a TV journalist, not because, but because if something important happened on it, you could easily find out about it, and because the news cycles weren't allocated that way anymore, and so we were constantly having to decide, make that decision. This is burning quickly. It's blowing up on social media. Do we respond, or do we pause and see if it burns out? Because a lot of those things burn super hot and burn out really quickly, and you don't necessarily want to dive in, because if the White House dives in, you're going to turn it into something bigger than it necessarily needed to be. The topic of race with President Obama, and David knows this even better than I, that this was something that ultimately he decided how he and we were going to discuss it, and I remember very distinctly conversations around the Trayvon Martin shooting, and other issues, and how he wanted to talk about them. And you remember the time he said that could have been my son, and that was pretty amazing. It was just amazingly powerful, in part because he hadn't been as direct about some of these issues as maybe some folks wanted him to be, all the time. But he had a very clear sense of how he wanted to talk about race, and I think the rest of us were in more so on that issue than almost any other. That was one where we were there to offer our views, but he would make up his mind about how he wanted to talk about it.
We're coming up on full time, so let's take just a quick rapid succession. What did you say? One more? Two more? We'll just do these last two. Just pose your question, and then we'll hold it and have the second question posed, and then we'll respond to both of them at once.
HQ2, Illinois and Chicago tend not to participate in the bidding war to race to the bottom on taxes. Is a whole lot of the debate going to be on the race to the bottom, or is it going to be on other issues?
So I'll just say that for us, what's vitally important is the labor pool. 50,000 is a lot of people, and we're a tech company that needs a lot of tech talent. And there's so many factors that go into what would make a great place for the headquarters that no single issue dominates in our decision making or will dominate.
And what's the latest anticipated timetable for a decision, as you best know?
I mean, honestly, I can tell you that I don't know, and that's true. I think it's likely by the end of the year that we'll have a final decision.
Thank you, Mr. Carney and Mr. Edwards, for being here. My question is, Amazon, as a global business operating in an era of greater political polarization, have political attitudes and behaviors translated into changes in consumer attitudes and behaviors towards brands, towards product categories, towards purchasing behaviors?
Wow. There's someone, I'm sure, at Amazon who has a better answer on that than I would. I don't know the answer to that question. I know that we have hundreds of millions of customers, and in general, and in the United States, we have millions of customers who come from every state and and I'm sure from every political persuasion. So I don't, it seems like that might be true, but I haven't looked at studies that say one way or the other. We focus on the service we can provide customers, the value proposition that we can provide, and let the rest take care of itself.
Yeah. We're coming up here on full time, but let's close with a story, if you don't mind. You were one of the pool reporters who were stationed and attached to President George W. Bush on September 11th, 2001, with that trip down to Florida at the elementary school where he was reading. What do you recall from that day, and what lessons do you take from it?
Well, that's a good. So yeah, I kind of Zelig-like. I managed to be at certain places.
Moments,
I happened to be with President Bush on 9/11 because I was covering the White House for Time magazine, and I mean a couple of thoughts. So I won't go into the whole story, but I remember first I'd say the world can turn dramatically very quickly, and the political world can too, because the night before in Florida, I had dinner with one of his top aides, and the whole conversation was about, was George W. Bush frittering away his presidency? He just lost the Senate when somebody had defected from the Republican Party. People were calling for his defense secretary's head. He was spending a ton of time. He spent a whole month in Waco on vacation, and people were describing it as the A3 presidency. For newspaper readers, it's like we don't even care about making the front page. So
not an
all
A1.
of that got obliterated with the terrible events of the following day. We arrived. I remember in the motorcade. We arrived at the school for this education event, and when we hopped out, I later, in reading about it, learned that Condi Rice had gotten a call during that motorcade ride that a plane had hit one of the towers. When we hopped out of the motorcade and headed for that classroom, somebody in the press office, Bush press office, said, "Oh, just so you guys know, one plane hit one of the World Trade Center towers. We think it was a Cessna." Okay, so we all, the pool gathered in that classroom, about 15 folks, and the president came out and started reading to those kids. And that was in the days where pagers were much more prevalent, and although phones were also there, and the room just started vibrating at a moment there, and people started looking at their devices, and then Andy Card came in. He was the chief of staff and leaned over the president and whispered that that a second tower had been hit and we were under attack. And we were all like looking at our pagers and figuring out this. What I would say about that moment is that I think I disagree, obviously, with a lot of President Bush's policies, but I think he got a bad rap about how he handled that moment with those kids. And I don't think there was anything wrong with finishing the book. And you know, that movie made it out to be some like unbelievably prolonged period of time. It wasn't. And you know, I think President Bush is a good and decent man, and cares a lot about kids and didn't want to scare them. So he, what I also remember is Bush saying in the cafeteria where he was supposed to give an education speech, "I'm going back to Washington," and we rushed out and got on the motorcade and sped off to the airfield, got on Air Force One in the way back because that's where the press sat. I got to move up later in life, but. And we shot up like a vertical almost, like nothing we'd ever experienced, David. And it was, you know, we watched the towers come down on live television, and you know, everybody was wondering what we were doing, and the reporters were saying we were coming back to D.C., but we banked west and didn't know where we were landing until like 2 minutes before we landed. And another thing to their credit is nobody knew who who the target was and whether or not Air Force One was a target. Like when Ari Fleischer came back and he told us all to like take our batteries out of our phones, and you know, because they were freaking out. They didn't know, as of course they wouldn't, what was next. And when we landed at Barksdale Air Force Base, which is a landlocked Air Force base, Air Force One was surrounded by armed, you know, military personnel, as if like somebody might be coming out of the, you know, beyond the airfield and you know, invading the airbase. And then the president was motorcade. Well, you know, APCs were, you know, just on this military base to the where he could make the place where he could make secure communication. So I guess my takeaway from that is that I have a great deal of having since worked in a White House, understanding and appreciation for what that moment must have been like, and the you know, the enormity of it, and the responsibility that he must have felt as president, and others around him must have felt. And but I'll wrap it up with a story that's a little lighter, which is my wife was the newsreader for Good Morning America at the time for ABC News, and she was 8 months pregnant with our first child, so she couldn't go to New York to be the newsreader, so she was doing it from ABC's studio in the Hay Adams Hotel, which had a backdrop of the White House, and behind it, you know, well into Virginia. And she was on the air when the towers were hit, and when Charlie Gibson cut to her and said, you know, "Claire, what's that behind you? There's smoke," and that was the Pentagon being hit. So she ended up working all day from there. And there are great pictures of her at the desk with this huge, right off camera, this huge jug of Maalox, right next to her, because she was so pregnant. And long story short, I got to talk to her once. We got back. I was part of the, they shed a lot of the people from Air Force One at Barksdale before they went to NORAD. I was one of those. In Ari Fleischer's book, he talks about how I was yelling at him on the phone, because I would like to believe we in the Obama White House would not have kicked off half the press corps, because it was the wrong thing to do. But in any case, they sent a plane for us. We went back, and Washington was, you know, smoking, and I got into the city, and there were military police everywhere, and I got to the Hay Adams, and I saw my wife, and she was there in the hall, and she sort of waddled towards me, and I ran to her, and we hugged, and it was just, you know, it was an awful day for everybody, and tears, and she said, "I'm so sorry this happened on our anniversary." And I started laughing, because my wife has a terrible memory for important dates, and turns out we weren't married on September 11th, so she forgets my birthday a lot. So, so that was the only light moment of a really rough day.
Well, I wish you...
and I'll tell you one other story about George W. Bush. My child, Hugo, is now 16 and a half, was born, you know, in October 15th, and on day 2, I came back from the hospital, and there was an envelope, Federal Express envelope, just propped up on my door, and inside was a handwritten note from Bush to my son.
Wow, that's nice. That's nice. Well, I wish you and your wife a happy anniversary and your son a happy birthday whenever that takes place.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it, Jeff. Thank you.